The opinions and viewpoints expressed in .NET Rocks are not necessarily those of its sponsors, or of Microsoft Corporation, its partners, or employees. .NET Rocks is a production of Franklin's Net, which is solely responsible for its content. Franklin's Net, training developers to work smarter. Hey, Rockheads! Stop looking for cracked software signatures and listen up. It's time for another stellar episode of .NET Rocks, the internet audio talk show for .NET developers with Carl Franklin and Rory Blythe. This is Jeff Macielix, here to announce show number 89 with guests Don Box, Ted Neward, and Mark Pollack, recorded live Monday, November 15th, 2004. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net, training developers to work smarter, and now offering hands-on VBNet, ASP.NET, and C# classes. Online at www.franklins.net. And by Data Dynamics, makers of ActiveReports.net. Simple, powerful, and cost-effective reporting for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.datadynamics.com. Support is also provided by Code Magazine, Microsoft Technologies in-depth for IT managers and developers. Online at www.code-magazine.com. And now, the man who can't believe the heavyweights he's interviewing tonight must be the absence of Kirk Webb, Carl Franklin.
What's up? Yo. Hey, this is Carl, and you're listening to .NET Rocks, the internet audio talk show for .NET developers. My friend, my partner in crime, Rory Blythe from Portland, is not with us tonight because of scheduling mix-ups. We spent last week in Las Vegas, as you know, and I got back 15 minutes before we were to record Mondays. And as it turned out, I couldn't get back here in time to record .NET Rocks. So, and also, as you may know, Rory is sort of locked in to only being able to do the show on Friday night. So he's off doing his job somewhere. And it's a shame, too, because we've got some real heavyweights, as Jeff said, on the show today. Don Box just happened to be around, and Ted and Mark were scheduled to talk about Java. And Ted sent Don an IM, and he's going to join us. So I'm going to let you read their bios on the website and just introduce Don Box, Mark Pollack, and Ted Neward. How are you guys?
Good. How are you?
Great. Excellent.
Awesome. I
sense a small escalation here.
I am severely outclassed here tonight. So, knowing not much at all about Java, I'm just going to basically let you guys talk. And this all started because somebody suggested I get Mark on, who's a partner at Code Street, and to talk about the things that are happening in the Java world, because there's some really, really interesting things going on. And I called up Ted to see if he wanted to join the conversation, because he sort of does a good job of bridging the .NET and Java world with us. And of course, Don just happened to be hanging out. So I guess, Mark, we should start with you. What is this new cool stuff that you wanted to talk about in the Java world?
Well, actually, it's a port. It's really the .NET world. It's a conversion of a popular Spring framework to .NET. And so it's really, I guess, the crossroads was sort of the interesting topic of seeing how some ideas from a popular open source Java project translate into .NET.
So for the .NET programmers who never heard of Spring, let's define what that is.
It's an application framework, basically, that has many layers of functionality. At its most base layer, there's a basic lightweight container, as they call it, which is sort of a glorified object factory that creates objects for you, configures them, resolves dependencies between different objects. But then on top of that, Spring offers things like AOP support for doing abstract-oriented programming, various helper classes for helping the EJB development, and sort of a whole slew of transaction management facilities. So in some sense, there's a lot of the same stack that people find in EJB that they could use in a sort of a la carte manner with these higher levels of functionality that the Spring Framework offers.
So, Ted or Don, have you guys heard of this thing, the Spring.net, the .NET version here?
Well, yeah. I mean, Rod Johnson, the guy who invented it, was at the Server-Side Symposium in 2004, back in May. And, basically, to a large degree, Spring has been kind of a reaction, almost a rejection of the EJB and the complexity therein, because a lot of Java developers are not building, these super high-end, high-scalable systems. A lot of these guys are trying to build, systems that are intended for 100 to 500 concurrent users, and, we'd like to develop them in a time frame that doesn't measure in years and so forth. And that's kind of where, the Spring stuff started from. And it's been interesting to watch because, Don may disagree with me, but to a large extent, the .NET development enterprise, community seems to have grown from we want to start from the departmental project and grow into the large-scale enterprise project, where the J2E guys seem to be going the other direction. And it's kind of fun to watch these two environments sort of, at this point, they're on a head-on collision course for one another at some point, somewhere in the middle. So it's going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I mean, what I add to it, it's exactly right, that if you look at building an application using Spring, it more closely resembles, what sort of facilities there are in .NET than it does in EJB application, at least before the EJB3 specification came out.
Yeah, even there, I mean, once EJB3 ships, I don't think it's really going to change much for your average Java developer, because all they're really doing is just, right now, when you write an EJB app, Carl, you know how, for example, like when you build a COM+ app, you use the attributes in IDL to indicate transactional affinity and so forth? Well, we didn't have any such facility in Java, right? Remember, we just recently defined custom attributes for Java, which is actually how Mark and I met, because he took over the open source project that I'd started to do that.
Wow.
And so that's what, the 175 JSR was about.
Yeah, anyway. I got involved in Spring because they wanted to use the attribute report that I had developed.
Right. So basically, in order to be able to do that equivalent, you had to write this rather hideous-looking XML file called a deployment descriptor. And what EJB 3.0 is basically trying to do is make those XML files go away in favor of using, as COM+ has been doing all these years, use custom annotations, custom attributes to capture some of that stuff. There's a few other things, but that's like the big thing, and that's why a lot of Java developers are interested in following the EJB 3.0 release.
So, Don, what's your exposure to this, to Spring and or Spring.net?
Well, I certainly have been observing the phenomena. It's pretty fascinating to watch the reaction to the heavier weight containers. I'm not really sure what role these things play on the .NET side, although I think it's great people are doing the thought experiment, if nothing else.
Yeah.
I think people pay attention a lot to the enterprise service aspects of Spring, but those are really the highest levels of the application framework. At its heart, there's just a very simplistic, not even simplistic, but a very simple, conceptually simple object factory, which really is more reminiscent of a traditional abstract factory you might read about in Gang of Four or whatever. And there's a lot of value to that, just to support basic OO concepts like separating inheritance, interfaces from implementation and so on. And it really ends up structuring the application and giving you flexibility and pluggability in ways that you really wouldn't have been led down that path before if you were just left to your own devices.
Being left to your own devices, I suppose, is what the experience of most Java programmers is, isn't it? Because there isn't a base class library that's a sort of a standard, right? I mean, I know my brother's a Java programmer, and we sort of compare notes once in a while. And he's using Pojo, plain old Java objects, where developing every line of code from the ground up. You find a lot of developers have gone that way?
Well, you got to remember, Carl, that the Java community does not have one IDE that everybody uses.
Right.
So we have to be somewhat careful in terms of what degree of support do you want. Now, at the same time,
Ted, I should correct you. There are people who don't use Emacs on this platform. It is not a monoculture. There are a few people who use other alternative IDEs, but yes, you're right. The majority of us do use Emacs.
Well, I still recall I think it was PDC a number of years ago when .NET was first introduced, and Don stood up and fired up his what was it, Cygwin shell, or were you on a Mac at that point?
Oh, I don't even remember.
Room's going, LS, is that a new command in the command shell? It looks like it's doing a dir type thing.
I had to explain dir to a student today. It was heartbreaking.
Sure.
Anyway.
So anyway, I mean, just the Java community, right, it's so anarchic, right? It's almost, organic in its sense that, we do have some higher order tools and utilities and so forth. Remember, MS Build was basically considered a clone of Ant. Which, of course, grew up in the Java community because we discovered that Make just doesn't cut it. So there's been a lot of cross-pollination back and forth, which is good. But the thing that the Java folks don't have in some respects is any sort of agreement to a certain degree between all these various projects. So you've got 4 or 5 of these different lightweight containers that are doing many of the same things that Spring is doing. So trying to get agreement, when you say there's no one base class library, you're right. There's like 4 or 5. And that's where the fun begins. That's where you get into the principle of framework parallelization.
I was going to say, do you think that sort of environment yields better results, but maybe over a longer term? Sort of where the cream rises to the top, whereas, with Microsoft, it's sort of dictated, that we all use the same framework, which is good, I think. But I don't have any experience in the other camp.
I think it yields a situation where it's both a plus and a minus, right? There's a very old saying, and I don't know who said it, but there's a very old saying that says your strength is also your weakness is also your strength. And I think that's what you get, right? In the Java world right now, we wrestle with the problem, you get a group of Java guys together, and the first question we have to agree on is what IDE are we going to use? The second question we have to agree on is what web framework are we going to use? Right. The third question is what, container are we going to use? We just get into all of this, paralysis by framework decision making that just, you don't see that in the .NET space. At the same time, you start getting into a situation, you start going, gosh, I really wish ASP.NET did X, Y, or Z. Well, too bad. Right. In the Java space, there's probably at least 1 or 2 frameworks that does X, Y, or Z. And if not, you'll just go off and start your own. Right.
Well, nobody's saying you couldn't start your own in ASP.NET either, but...
Yeah, we're one of the developers we work with, Alex, he's developing master page support for use in 1.1. But
with ISAPI, all things are possible.
Yeah,
yeah, but it's kind of a cultural thing, Carl, more than anything else.
No, I hear you.
In the Java space, the idea, if I'm going to go, if something doesn't do what I want it to do, I'll go and write something and contribute it back to the community. I just don't see that amongst the .NET developers, that I talk to and hang out with. Now, fortunately, some of the guys I talk to, Craig Andera just finished working on FlexWiki, which is a great open source project in the .NET space. But that's like one of a couple dozen. In the Java space, there are hundreds, if not thousands.
Yeah, although, Ted, I'm remembering back to the old days of the OS2 versus Windows debates of the late 80s, early 90s. And one of the classic characterizations was that the reason you had all these, that there was so much debate from the OS2 side, and the Windows folks, nobody would pretty much show up for the debates, is because, the Windows folks are off busy solving problems.
and making money, yeah.
Sure.
There is something to be said for, people can use the new operator, and, if they have to change it, they fix the code, and it solves the problem. And sitting around, doing naval contemplation about how to add indirection to new isn't something that this culture is as conducive to. Unlike the Java world, which is, just ripe with that kind of experimentation. And as someone who could just observe it from the outside, kind of like an archaeologist, it's great. I'm fascinated by it. But I'm pretty thankful that a lot of people I work with aren't twisted around that particular axle.
You wouldn't want to spend the rest of your days sort of redoing
I think a lot of people do this in their own spare time. Certainly I am, right? And so it's sort of an itch that people scratch. And I think as for example, things move on, in .NET as well, we'll probably see more of this. It's just been going on, I think, a bit longer in terms of really, community thinking this way.
Well, Mark, you mentioned a couple things about Spring. Let's dive into that in a little bit of detail. You mentioned some transaction support.
Yeah, in the Java world, what you're able to do is really just have an abstraction of transaction management, and in some sense, this is a reaction again to the way that things were done in EJBs, where people really liked a lot having declarative transactions. Yeah. Where you can just annotate or use in a configuration file, right. Saying where you begin and stop your transaction. But really couldn't do that, for example, if you're just using plain JDBC as your transaction management. You had to use JTA. And so what this did is, Spring does, is it allows you to plug in an implementation of a transaction manager. You could use very commonly in most applications, you just have one single database and would have no need to use a full-fledged distributed transaction service, but yet you could still get the features of declarative transactions. And if you needed to scale up for some reason in your application to use that facility, you could, and you wouldn't be tied in to having to use.
That's pretty cool. What were some of the other things, just quickly? Well,
the other thing is sort of an abstraction of that is sort of AOP in general, where declarative transaction management is just one particular, aspect, one particular, custom attribute that results in that particular behavior of starting and stopping a transaction. But you're free to invent your own, such as pooling. You might think of all the enterprise stuff, but even such simple things as logging, or is very popular as well, is security. You have want to impose a particular security policy on your code. You can sort of inject, sprinkle around particular pieces of code that you otherwise would be dependent upon the container to provide a particular implementation of.
Attributes are really the big story then.
That's one way to express it, but the idea really being that you have the ability to pick a particular place in sort of a very abstract way in your code, saying all methods that have this particular signature will have this functionality attached to it.
So since we've got a live developer of one of these frameworks, I've had a list of questions I've been dying to figure out. One is, I know that in the interception plumbing we've got around Microsoft, both MTS, CommPlus, and the context plumbing and the CLR, we have to bend over backwards to make sure that when an object reference is being intercepted, floats out in the wild, that we never let raw, unintercepted references get out. With these dependency injection frameworks, how are you guys plumbing it such that naked references don't seep out through by accident?
Yeah, the way it works in Spring, I suppose, is different, for example, if you're using AspectJ, but the way it works in Spring is you ask the object factory to create you a proxied instance.
Sure, but what happens if I've got, if inside of my object, I'm calling to someone that's being intercepted, I call out to someone else, and I pass my this reference as a parameter to someone else?
Yeah, that's fine.
So how does the guy who I'm passing it to get the interceptor?
If the object you were passing originally was a proxied class, he just gets a reference to that proxied class.
But if I'm in an instance method on the proxied class, my this pointer is unadorned, it's unintercepted, it's raw. And if I pass that to someone else, I lose all of these dependency injection features.
I guess the point is that this pointer you're passing around is already the proxied class.
But at the language level, inside my instance method, the this variable is raw. It's not wrapped.
Mark, are these all dynamic proxies in Spring? Is that how?
Spring is dynamic proxies for interfaces, but it uses CGlib for classes. So
you're doing bytecode weaving then?
No, well, it would do bytecode weaving if you wanted to apply an aspect to a class, but very commonly you can just apply this to an interface, and then you can use Java's dynamic proxy facility, which is very flexible for doing this type of thing.
The question Don's asking is, okay, so inside the object that got proxied, right? This still refers to that object, not the proxy.
Oh, that is correct, yeah.
So then the question that he was asking is, how do you prevent me from returning this from inside the object?
You don't.
Passing it as a parameter to someone else.
you could potentially do that, I suppose.
So I guess the answer, Don, is don't do that.
Yeah, seems like it.
Wow,
we have
that's
our own.
great.
We have our own don't do that's in .NET. You know, we have a.
Well, it's one of those things. I mean, you know, the point though, Carl, is still valid, which is to say, you know, this becomes one of those myths, legends, and lore that developers just have to learn.
Right, right.
And when you're doing a project that's the size of, you know, Com Plus or Indigo or something, you know, don't do that just doesn't fly very far.
Yeah,
There were lots of don't do that's in Com, and we all know how well that worked.
Sure. Yeah, there's dispose, right? We still
But
have.
I think normally the way you would, for example, in the IOC, the way you would configure the application to begin with is that usually all the references you would have that you'd want to pass around typically would be set through the container itself, through its dependency resolution mechanism. But it doesn't mean there isn't enough rope, I suppose, to shoot yourself in the foot in some way. And really, in any sort of technique, you're going to have best practices.
Yeah,
it's just like there is, for example, in .NET remoting or things like that. You can do things in particular ways that maybe aren't a best practice. It doesn't mean it's should be disallowed explicitly.
Yeah, although there's differences between best practices and will the plumbing actually work. And while there's tons of things you probably don't want to do with .NET remoting, certainly the remoting and context plumbing really went to great lengths to make sure that naked references never seeped out for any number of reasons.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Look at the time.
There's no doubt that particular aspect of how well embedded proxies are inside .NET is more well covered and well hidden or well baked in than it is in Java.
You see, I think this is one of the interesting things that you call out and you look at, just the differences in scope, right? Because, for example, for a container like Spring, I mean, as much as I love Rod and as much as I like Spring, this is still, a very, very small percentage of the overall Java community is using this.
Yeah.
And at least amongst the Spring code that I've seen being used in the wild, that situation just has never come up. Right, where you've written a component that wanted to return this, and so
these tend to be, let's say, service interfaces to remote things, right? So they're usually well-defined boundaries.
Sure, but quite often, you'll be inside of an initialization routine. You want to register with some event handler that's ambient in the container or gets passed in. Those things like that show up, but you're right, they're not in your face all the time.
Yeah, this would probably be one of those subtleties that unless you've gone down that road, like you have, Don, with some of the Com and Com Plus stuff, you wouldn't think about it. I mean, I know I wouldn't have thought about it except for, some of the stories that I've heard floating around, amongst the tribe about some of the old Com stuff and the interception marshalling and some of that kinds of stuff. It's like, oh, I know where he's going with this. But it's not something that the Java community has had really any real experience with yet.
Well, if I could just play devil's advocate, we also have, release com object that we have to do in .NET, little things like that we have to sprinkle around, which is plumbing code, to get the plumbing to work.
Oh, no question.
So, we have our you got to do is it or it doesn't work kind of thing.
Oh, don't get me wrong, Carl. Both platforms have their warts. It's just that the warts are different because of the different experiences of the developers.
Right. Yeah. So, if I can change direction here real quick, do Ted, Don, Mark, either of you guys ever think that we're ever going to see value types in Java?
Yes, there are 6 of them.
There are
now. They're predefined, and you can't ever change them.
The number will not decrease.
Okay. I don't think so.
All right.
It's hard to say.
But that's a very core language question.
Right.
Well, and the thing is, Sun has always been very historically reticent to change things about the core virtual machine. I mean, you look at, for example, Java just recently got generics. Well, these are generics purely at the language level, right? So a list of T in Java after compilation, it's just straight list holding, object references. because they didn't want to go through the potential pain. And I say potential because I don't think it would have been as bad as people at Sun seem to think it would have been, of adding generic types, the bang 0, bang 1 that we see inside the CLR 2.0 today.
Yeah.
They didn't want to put that in because they have 7 years of history that they need to support at this point. Right. That's one of the key differences. In the beginning of a technology curve, you have the ability to do radical innovation.
Yeah.
By the time you get to this point in the technology curve, 7 to 8 years deployment is stuff in production. You have to be much, much more careful about changing stuff.
Yeah, who knows better than Microsoft? I mean,
what is it? Every 8 years or so, Microsoft reinvents a new platform.
Right. But they have to be so backward compatible that it's slowed the process of innovation.
Hence, release COM object, as we said a few minutes ago.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So, this is,
that's partially a reason the backlash for EJB was invented even, released before there was even, 1.2 or dynamic proxies, which would have really changed the way it would have appeared, I suppose.
Yeah, to a certain degree, but I think the largest problem with EJB in its initial release, Mark, was the fact that they wrote a spec before they sat down to think about how they would do it.
Yeah, in that sense, now it's actually the EJB3 actually probably be the first spec that really reflects some real-world experience in terms of OR mapping and configuration.
Well, what's the old rule? You never use a technology until it hits its 3.0 release?
Yeah, well, we have to wait for C# 3.0.
You have to admit, though, it's ironic that, people are excited about EJB3, but at the same time, you're seeing all of this kind of, not anti, but, certainly alternative container stuff, around the same time frame as EJB3 is landing.
I think those people typically sit on opposite sides of the fence. That people who are real, fans of Spring and whatnot, I think would say that by the time EJB3 comes out, it might almost be irrelevant because it'll be too long from now.
Sure. Well, I think part of the thing too is that there was sort of two concepts wrapped up in EJB that have now started to get teased apart. One was the concept of transactional processing that, EJB sort of highlights at the highest level, but the second was the more subtle concept of containers and being in a container-managed environment. That was something that was never really talked about explicitly until people started teasing out. And then this is basically what Spring and the other guys do, teasing out the idea of being in a container versus just being, something that I knew up and start making use of. And that, I think, it's been very beneficial to people because now they're starting to say, wow, I can get the benefits of container management without having to go down the whole EJB distributed transaction route. This is pretty cool. And that, I think, ultimately benefits everybody because in many respects, that's what Com Plus was about. And that's what, Indigo seems to be about going forward,
Yes, sometimes, though, I think, at least from my perspective, from, porting over Spring to Spring Java to Spring.net, is that the lowest layer really just is basic object factory, which is where, in fact, a lot of people live day to day wondering about what are the layers inside their particular application, not how does my application interact with another one and the security between them. That the structure that provides sort of in the small programming is very beneficial and almost in some sense, this is why I see value in Spring.net just from the sort of container point of view. We don't have these features now of declarative transactions, let's say using ADO.net transactions, but yet you can see that your application is structured and is much more pluggable and testable because you can easily swap in and out interfaces that particular classes use, and this is really just very valuable, just very basic, bare bones OO best practice stuff. Mother's milk. It's very hard to disagree with.
Mark, where do you see Java going technically in the next 5 years?
Whew.
No. Ask him a hard one, Carl.
I don't know. I see a lot of angle brackets in my future.
Yeah.
I think to a certain degree, it kind of depends on what stuff that's coming out this year or next year or last year really sort of sticks with the community, and what stuff the community as a whole just kind of shrugs their shoulders and says, "Oh well." I mean, one of the things that I would love to see is some greater XML integration into the language as a whole. For example, I love the fact that Anders is talking about doing, we've got nullable types coming in C# as part of 2.0, and he's talking about doing greater relational style operators and integration into the language for C# 3.0, because that's going to drive Sun and some of the other vendors in the space to really openly consider the idea of baking relational concepts into this language. Because like it or not, as much as we'd love to talk about language purity, at the end of the day, I have work that needs to get done, and we need to make sure that the tools I use support what I'm trying to do. Everybody's doing relational, OR mappings and relational access and stuff like that. The languages should reflect that. The languages should integrate some of those concepts and make it easier for me to get stuff out of a database and put it back.
Yeah.
And so hopefully, we'll see some integration with XML and XML types into both Java and C#, and hopefully we'll see the same kinds of stuff for relational types.
So, Ted, it sounds like what you're saying is to know what Java is doing in 5 years, you should look and see what C# is doing in 2.
Oh, absolutely. And I think to know what C# will be doing in 5 years is to look at what Java will be doing in 2.
So
these two environments are keying off of each other in a major way.
I was going to say, which is doing more keying? Obviously C# learned a ton from Java, but is Java learning from .NET? I mean, the Spring thing is like an open source project, not by Sun, right? So is Sun learning anything from .NET?
Oh, you just have to look at JDK 1.5 to know that the answer there is yes.
Okay.
Something as simple as the for each loop.
Right. We now have a for construct very similar to the for each construct in C#. We now have enumerated types in Java. Do those ring a bell?
Mm-hmm.
Java was the whole notion of
annotations is the other big one.
Yeah, annotations. The whole notion of generics in Java. People in the Java community have been screaming about generics for the better part of 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's not until C# starts talking about generics that, we're going to factor that into the JDK 1.5 release. I mean,
cool.
That's not revisionist history there?
What's that?
I mean, I think that, they were planning generics for quite a while before, at least for my...
Well, they were talking about it for a long time, but, talking about it and doing it are two very, very different things. The thing is just you get into a situation where when does it become important to you to spend the time and energy to make this feature work?
Yeah.
Right. And that's the thing, right? We've been talking about generics for I don't know how many years. And ever since JDK 1.0 shipped, it seemed there were people who were out there doing templates in Java. And now all of a sudden JDK 1.5, here we have generics. You can't tell me that wasn't because .NET all of a sudden started talking about wanting to put generics into C# and so forth. I mean, for crying out loud, JDK 1.4, we seem to have time to put the assert keyword in, even though that was something that nobody really seemed to be getting really upset about.
Well, arguably, generics is much more difficult, right?
Well, okay, but then let's spend more time getting that one to work.
I'm not going to debate the priorities or things like that. I'm really in no position.
I just think that it was, and it just seems to me that this was something that was very clearly driven by the fact, this is what's happening on the other side of the fence, and so therefore we need to.
Well, there's a lot of that going back and forth, obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just think that both of these environments are going to be keying off of each other for the foreseeable future. For obvious reasons, right? If anyone, right now the industry as a whole is in a mode where if one guy has something that the other guy doesn't have, it's a PR nightmare, so we've got to have that thing.
Yeah, okay. I'm almost out of questions here. I'm just so inexperienced with Java, I don't really know what to talk about next.
Well, I think one of the questions that frequently comes up when I talk to people about, Java and .NET and so forth is there's sort of this underlying concern amongst both camps, right, of do I need to learn the other environment, in order to remain employable?
Yeah.
And clearly the answer for .NET developers is no, and clearly the answer for Java developers is no. I mean, you can learn a lot from learning the other environment, but it's not something you need to do to remain employable.
Right, it's not going to help your job.
Yeah, I mean, like you had said, Carl, C# borrowed a lot from Java and the experiences that Java developers ran into. For example, right, on my weblog not too long ago, which Don picked up and used at UPSLA, I had said that object relational mapping is, the Vietnam of computer science. And the reason I said that is because I've watched Java developers over the past decade try one object relational tool after another, or try to write their own, and just get sunk in this quagmire of work and effort. And, all of a sudden you look around and go, why exactly did we go down this painful road again?
Yeah.
Yet, the pressure has been in Microsoft for years, for a decade, to have some kind of object relational mapping, and thus we saw object spaces sort of poke its head out and then duck back inside the big house.
Right.
And I would not be surprised if object spaces never ships. And there's certainly, based on a lot of experiences people in the Java community have had with OR mappers, there's a lot of compelling reason for Microsoft to never ship it.
Well, I like the idea of integrating it with WinFS just because it's it's something that can be so utilized at a very fundamental level. You know what I mean? That if it's too high level of a tool, you know what I mean? If it's too much of a container, if it's too much on the outside looking in, then it won't be able to do the job 100%.
Well, are you looking for just, easy persistence, or are you looking for object relational mapping?
Both.
Those are two very different beasts.
I'm looking at being able to, seeing as how WinFS is sort of the center of the universe of the Longhorn operating system in terms of how data is accessed and accessible and described, it just makes sense that, persisted or not persisted, being able to integrate the objects of the operating system into an object relational mapper is where I see that WinFS integration really being fantastic.
Problem that I have in general, just from a purely aesthetic perspective, is that the object model and the relational model are so fundamentally different that any attempt we have to try to map the two, I think, ultimately is going to yield failure. Yeah. I think if you have a simple enough...
it's been a bit too harsh on the mappers. We use them to quite a good extent, I think, and quite a successful extent in mapping a domain model, to the database. I think from the examples I've seen as well recently, where you have this object data source and doing data binding to a table, it seems that there's more appreciation of having a pure domain model in the middle tier now in Microsoft community than there has been before, where you would pass around data sets, really.
Well, but see, here's the problem you run into, Mark. First of all, the atom in an object relational mapping layer, the atom is the object, right? So if I want to pull back a person, right, I pull back a person. And now we get into those gnarly questions of, do I pull back all of the fields of that person or not? Do I lazy load or eager load? If I lazy load, then I have to go back to the data store each time for each field, or at least once more to get the fields that aren't there. If I eager load, I'm pulling back a bunch of data that I didn't need in the first place.
So let's stick a layer between them.
Well, you get to, usually the language that, the OQL or whatever the equivalent would be would give you the expressivity to pull in what you wanted just as you would with a normal SQL statement.
Right, but what am I coding against? What's the return of that OQL inside my language?
Still an object, right, which is sort of the whole point of it, right?
Well, but see, the object is what? If it's a person type, then the person type has fields. You have to have, you either have the object or you don't.
Well, usually the lazy loading is, related to collections, right?
Well, collections are where this problem raises its head. But even if I just want to retrieve a person and the person has 50 some odd fields, do I pull back all 50 or not? When all I was interested in is just the guy's first name and last name.
Well, you still get to declare that, right? Just as you would in SQL.
Okay, but you keep saying it's just like SQL. It's just like SQL. Why wouldn't I just use SQL at this point?
Of course, you don't have to write all that plumbing code yourself to populate the object.
What plumbing code?
To copy. There are cases, right, for example, where you don't have a very complex domain model, right, where you don't have a lot of inheritance or a lot of, strategy patterns or things like this to use to calculate rates or stuff like that. So, every solution has, different solutions require, different problems require different solutions. But from what I've seen, if you have a relatively, complex domain model with functionality, not just data, then you can still populate the objects as you want. I don't think it's, as much of a problem as you say getting these extra fields in that you might not want. You can still, say you don't load them, and in which case those references are null, or they're just set to default values that you would set in the object constructor. But you don't have to worry about that plumbing code, right?
But look at how much you're bubbling up, how much this mapping is bubbling to the forefront. Right?
It's not. The domain model is completely pure, right? You don't see
but
any
it's not.
remnants.
It's not, Mark. That's my point. I pulled back a person. This person has a first name and a last name. The natural thing to get his age is to say p.age. And all of a sudden p.age comes back as int min. You're like, what the hell? Oh, that's right. I forgot that when I issued this query, I said in this mapping file, in this descriptor file, whatever, I was only pulling back first name and last name.
So why not have an attribute on the properties that says whether the data is loaded on demand or not? I mean, isn't there...
Well, again,
aren't there layers? Aren't there... Because there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, right?
That's exactly the point,
You got to insert some intelligence in there, and have some more attributes on the fields that, may be heavy or may not be heavy. Just like the garbage collector, when it looks at an object reference, doesn't know whether it's looking at a 5 megabyte bitmap or an int. It doesn't. That's
exactly the point, Carl, is you're making this decision at the person type, and it's going to be used very differently across two different queries,
right?
Where the semantics you would want are very different.
Right. So what is the solution for that? I mean, is there, are there attributes that you can plop in there and settings and metadata that you can put in to situationally sort of drive the behavior of these objects?
Well, again, this is where the Vietnam analogy becomes so profound, right?
Yeah.
Because in the beginning, right, if you recall your history, in the beginning, Vietnam was just a place where we had sent a bunch of advisors, and that was it. And had we stopped there, Vietnam would not nearly have scarred the country the way it did. But we didn't stop there. We wanted to do more and more and more and more, and all of a sudden we had 250,000 guys on the ground looking around going, why are we here? What's the point? Etc. Mm-hmm. This is the problem you get into when you start doing the OR mapping and you start wanting to express even complex queries.
Okay.
Right.
All right, but let's say you didn't
have... I guess that hasn't been my particular personal experience in particular. You can still expose essentially the OQL, whatever you want to call it, that's particular to the OR mapping tool in a configuration file. And of course, you still have to know what your queries are doing, what they're returning. I mean, nothing, is going to remove you from that.
That's what I want to say.
It's not quite like an OO database where you have to get at things through navigation, right?
I just want to make this comment, and sorry, I felt like I was butting in there too much, but what's the difference, Ted? If it's complex, it's complex. If you have to write explicit code to go get the data from SQL Server in one situation and not write explicit code to go get the data from SQL Server in another situation, why not make that process easier by just adding an attribute here or an attribute there? Do you know
basically,
what I'm saying?
I have two reactions. First of all, if we all agreed that OR layers would solve the easiest 80% or the easiest 50% or whatever that number is, and stopped and agreed to go and write regular SQL and ADO.NET to go get the rest of it,
right,
I would be happy. I would be satisfied.
Yeah,
but that's
I think
not
that's
what
a reasonable
happens.
position.
I do
that's
too.
That's not what happens, guys.
No, I think probably the Java community has been overzealous, clearly, right, in the use of OR mapping tools. But it doesn't mean it doesn't have its role, right? And plain JDBC or plain ADO.NET certainly has their role as well.
Well, see, this is why, for example, in Effective Enterprise Java, there's my one and only book plug for the night. In Effective Enterprise Java, I say use objects-first persistence to preserve your domain model because you want to see objects and nothing but objects. But then use a relational-oriented model, a la writing SQL or stored procs or what have you, to expose the power of the relational model, right? Because realistically speaking, today, as we stand here, businesses want to store their data in a relational fashion. And we have to respect that and we have to honor that. And so you will never, because of the differences between the objects and the relational world, you will never be able to create a seamless mapping. Joel Spolsky.
No, I'm not saying it's...
Hang on a second. Joel on Software nails this completely when he talks about the law of leaky abstraction. And developers don't want the OR mappings to leak, but they do. And so they say, oh, well, we've got to put more smarts into the OR layers. And you end up with this disaster.
Well, that's a good point.
I'm not so down on OR mapping as you are, Ted, but maybe we can move on.
That's what makes the show interesting, right?
Yeah,
that's true. Roy Ogborn from the chat room says CSLA.net, which is Rocky Lotka's framework,
right.
recommends pulling a lightweight read-only object when you only want, say, employee first name, last name, and when one needs to update employee, say, then a full read-write object is pulled. So, obviously there's, I totally agree with you, Ted, that in general, and Mark, you said it too, developers find a new technology, whether it's inheritance, or whatever it is, and they see what they can do with it, and they start building castles in the sky in their minds, and they get overzealous. They want to get as much experience with it as possible, and so they exercise the piss snot out of it, and usually to the detriment of the project that they're doing this with. Here's another one: database table over normalization, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody went to some seminar back in the early '90s where some guy said
normal form working.
Yeah, normalization is a must. We have to completely normalize our tables, and what started as 5 tables now ends up as 50 tables, and you do a simple query and it's too slow. Well, maybe it's because you have 25 joins here, So,
I'm not disputing that at all.
So it's the nature of the beast of programmers to get a new technology and then go overboard with it. And so I agree with Ted that you can't look towards any one technology as a magic bullet. You have to sort of temper it, and maybe people are going a little nuts with ORM.
Well, I think where we got down this road was because I said, we want that the .NET community is going to learn from the mistakes of the Java community, and this was one place where the Java community really, really went deep. Right.
And also, part of it was that people were using the EJB spec to do persistence, right? Which I think was probably a flawed model, right? And so that meant you had to inherit from various base class objects in Java that wouldn't work outside the container. Mm-hmm. But in some sense, that's kind of what gave rise to these less invasive OR mapping.
Well, there is
definitely a legacy to learn from, right, in terms of approach to how you can do this, that it's palatable and not invasive.
Mm.
Well, there's a certain degree of invasiveness that's going to happen. I mean, you see it with JDO. You see it with a lot of OR layers where you say to yourself, the whole OR thing was a place where the Java guys went deep. The whole I can't test with EJB, that was mostly due to the lack of a lightweight EJB container. And we've since seen, OpenEJB, for example, has shipped. You could conceivably do testing with OpenEJB. So again, I think that what's coming out is sort of this difference between the container managed environment and the notion of the EJB API itself. And I think that distinction is an important one.
Yeah, some things, though, that clearly I think are taking foothold in .NET community that were at least popularized first in the Java community are test-driven development and all that sort of XP-ish, I guess, like stuff of continuous builds. But that's definitely been, I think, a good translation into the .NET world.
Yeah. Well, here we go, talking about our favorite guys up there at Data Dynamics, about ActiveReports.net. I was just teaching in my ASP.NET class this week, teaching somebody the difference between, like, say, CrystalReports.net, SQL Reporting Services, and ActiveReports.net. And the basic difference is with those first two, SQL Reporting Services, Crystal Enterprise, you basically have a server dedicated to reports that you're going to be pulling lots and lots of complicated data and serving up to thousands of people. But that's not what Active Reports is all about. Active Reports is about putting the report code right in your assembly, utilizing Visual Studio internally, and being able to provide real cool-ass reports in ASP.NET or Windows applications, Windows Forms applications, and PDF, no problem. HTML, no problem. And the Windows Forms version also has a designer, which is cool. You can let your customer design their own and customize their own reports. So Active Reports is made possible by Data Dynamics, of course, which is a great supporter of .NET Rocks, the movie, coming out soon to a theater near you. And we'd like you to go do us a favor and go up to their website to check their stuff out. It's at www.datadynamics.com. And it isn't going to break the bank either, folks. It's very affordable stuff. Let me get back to Spring for a second. If Spring is so cool in Java, why does the Java community or why does the .NET community need a Spring.NET? Like, why do we need a .NET version of Spring?
Yeah, really what we have right now is just basically this very flexible object factory. It's a lightweight container, really at its heart. And what this means is that you can just sort of apply sort of traditional, well-respected OO principles such as, coding to interfaces instead of to concrete classes. And, this helps in all sorts of ways because it really applies the discipline that you would be lazy to do if you had the code in abstract factory for every particular type that existed. And so when you have a class that depends on particular service, if you expose just the interface, at the end of the day, you really don't care usually how that might be implemented. Maybe it's a web service reference. Maybe it's .NET remoting. Maybe it's a local implementation.
Hey, Don, does this sound familiar?
Yes, it does.
And so what Spring is giving you really is basically through its configuration ability of creating objects and resolving their dependencies, just a very easy way essentially to reduce the cost of doing interface-based programming to almost zero. And for example, I didn't know very much about .NET remoting probably 3 months ago, and then I looked into one of the best practices that you should do in .NET remoting if you want to create objects on the client but not ship the implementation DLL over there. And lo and behold, it was an object factory.
Yeah.
And so it can provide sort of very simplistic services there that essentially expose a Spring factory remotably and as an SOA object and have it return COA objects. Really just helping facilitate a best practice simply because there's a very flexible object factory there.
And somebody in the chat room wants you to mention the web features of Spring.
Yeah, we really haven't done too much. Someone just recently committed to CVS, like I said, support for master pages style 2.0 programming in the 1.1 environment. Right. But really, the core focus right now is making this base object factory very stable, and then moving on to provide AOP support. And the other aspects, I think we'll feel our way and see what's appropriate. Certainly not the intention to reinvent the wheel. Just to add value where we can in small but I think significant ways. For example, there are no plans to really introduce a MVC-like framework into ASP.NET.
Okay. So where do you see Spring going? I mean, how far is this going to go, do you think?
Well, I see a lot of...
over the world.
Over the world. Going to be everywhere. Well, one interesting thing is that a lot of shops that I've expressed interest in are already using Spring in the back end, basically.
Okay. And
they have .NET clients they like to write in the front end. And the fact that there's sort of this parallel universe in terms of your basic low-level plumbing of how you would construct your application, they really like that synergy there. In particular, in terms of you can go buy one of the many books that are out there in Spring and basically translate the word bean to object, and you basically have documentation for your Spring.NET IOC container.
There's one for Reflector.
Yeah. And that's actually one thing that we used to, I think, great success was putting the Spring.Java code base through the JLCA, Java Language Conversion Assistant, which was very useful in the porting effort.
Okay. Hey, Don, there's a new song there for the band, the JLCA.
I was just thinking the same thing.
Were you really?
Yes, I was. So, I fell off the line for a few minutes there. Did you guys talk about Pico versus Spring versus Nano versus?
No.
So I'd love to find out what the long-term strategy is for having N of these as opposed to one of them.
I don't think there's a plan per se, right? People will choose and use what they think is most appropriate. I guess as Ted was indicating, people pick the framework that's most suited for them. But the sort of synergy, I guess, that Spring has, which the others don't, are the sort of vertical stack of providing transaction management, all these enterprise-like features, whereas things like Pico or HiveMind are really focused on the basic IOC functionality.
Right. This is where you start to get into the thousand flowers blooming kind of thing, right? Where you just sort of plant seeds everywhere, and the stuff that blooms, okay, this is clearly solving an itch that people have. So, ultimately, all of the frameworks, Nano, Pico, et cetera, will have that. If only one of them gets it, it's because that one guy ran into that problem, and therefore it's not really a widespread thing. But even that, that takes time for some of that stuff to emerge. And what we're seeing right now is people are saying, ooh, containers are cool, but what should the container have? Well, now all of a sudden we start to diverge in opinion.
And the other nice thing is that it's very non-invasive, right? Meaning that you don't inherit from a Spring API in order to benefit from, the abstract factory. It's all based on reflection and a configuration file, or if you want it programmatically as well. So in principle, switching is not going to be a code change in as much as it is going to be a configuration change of how you declare your objects and how they're related to the container.
And I'm not sure how feasible that really will be, because there's certain semantics that you expect out of the framework, and you will write code differently based on those semantics.
Well, a lot of them have similar notions of life cycle, that after creating it, please call this method that I tell you for initialization. Mm-hmm. And if you're a singleton, when the container dies, please call this destroy. So there's some fair amount of commonality, I'd say, between all of them that you just got to have if you're going to be an IOC container. But, of course, there might be nuances. But if you really...
I mean, to me, those details, right? The devil's typically in the details.
I mean, we have a pretty large application. I would say maybe 1, 2, in some really obscure cases, actually inherit something from the Spring API.
Yeah, but have you actually tried porting it? Have you tried porting it to a different one?
Sorry?
Have you tried porting it to a different one?
I did little simple sample applications, which were very trivial to do, but not a very big one.
I mean, I freely admit I don't know, Mark. One of the things that...
Oh, yeah, in part of just playing around with it and learning. There was a recent blog entry. I'm trying to remember the name of the person who did a very nice write-up comparing, Mike Spile. Yeah.
Thinking of Matt Rabel?
No, I think it was Mike Spile, I think. Let me take a look.
Well, while you're looking, a question from the chat room, I think for Mark. Any chance for an AOP Alliance-type standard implementation for containers happening?
Well, the AOP Alliance API, we ported to .NET. It's part of the Spring download. So in that sense, that type of API that exposes how you would do, AOP functionality is there. I don't know if that answers the question. But we took from that API basically the structure in which we would form doing the AOP implementation.
Okay. We'll find out.
I'm trying to find that blog entry.
I would be kind of interested, Don, I don't know how much you can talk about Indigo, but I'd be kind of curious as to how much of Spring will make its way into Indigo or vice versa.
Well, I mean, with Indigo, we try not to impose a lot of policy on folks. In general, you can load us up in any app domain, so we don't have the same characteristics that a lot of EJB containers or even ASP.NET has, where we impose a particular process model, a particular app domain management policy. Pretty much with Indigo, you just load a DLL in your app domain and start using it. So in that respect, I think there's less of a obvious need for something like Spring. We at various times in the product cycle have gotten more or less enamored with lots of use of interception. There is obviously a messaging pipeline you can obviously wire yourself in at the obvious places, but how dominant that's going to be in terms of people using this stuff, I'm not convinced it's it's where everybody wants to be.
Well, it seems to me that at least I know more of the details of how things get implemented on the Java side, I'd say, but instead of inheriting from a base class in order to get manage transactional ability, one could use an aspect to inject that same code. Basically, the code has to live somewhere. It's just a matter of how it gets there.
Well, sure, and in Indigo, actually on this platform, you don't get transactions by inheriting from anything. If you look at .NET 2.0, which is the version we're shipping next year, we spent a lot of energy getting the transactions implementation really well integrated with the runtime, the programming models that people use, the existing kind of legacy that we've got with things like DTC and COM+. And in .NET 2.0, if you want to program with transactions, you just write a block inside of a method where you use a using statement, which basically sets up a lexical scope. And inside that lexical scope, you have a transaction, and when you leave the lexical scope, you don't. And so we don't impose a lot of the kind of the heavyweight stuff that EJB and to a degree COM+.
Well, you had to inherit from service component in .NET at least.
That was the old days.
Yeah. Don't we have a service domain thing in .NET 1.1 right now?
Yeah, in fact, if you've got .NET 1.1, which is the Everett release, which we shipped in 2003, we have this thing called service domain, which is kind of one of the inspirations for where we went with transactions, which allows you, again, to just set up as a block inside of any method call without any derivation mandate. I want this range of instructions to be protected by a transaction. Just so happens in .NET 2.0, we were able to do a lot of engineering to make the implementation a lot faster and require less additional gunk to get loaded into your process.
But isn't the issue then still of demarcation? For example, if you had one business method that you wanted to start and stop a transaction around, and that was in the code where you had used that using statement, but now, for example, you wanted two business methods to be within the same transaction, you'd have to move code around as compared to...
Yeah, certainly our experience from COM+ was that it was the developer who really wanted to demarcate transaction boundaries, not the admin.
No, I agree with you that as developer, there's no sort of mythical admin guy monkeying with transactions, but still having that flexibility to not make a code change.
Sure, but part of the way we set up the lexical blocks is they can effectively inherit a transaction from the causal call path. So, if A calls B, and B sets himself up with the appropriate kind of block, he'll inherit the transaction of A, similar to the way it works with EJB or with COM+.
Right.
But without the imposition of this kind of, forcing you down a particular container or framework model. It's basically, it's a line of code and you get a transaction.
Don, a question for you from the chat room. How do we handle the catching exceptions and rollback with a using block? Just with a try catch? How do you do the...
Yeah, great question. When you use the system.transactions infrastructure in WIDB, you basically use a using block, and you add a line at the end of the block that causes that tells us that you made it, that the transaction is okay to commit. And if you don't make it to the end, that is, if you leave the block through an abnormal termination, then we obviously roll it back. It's very similar to the old set abort, set complete paradigm that people were used to from MTS.
I think he was talking about Indigo, though, the thing that you were talking about with the using block and the lexical.
Oh, well, you can use exactly what I just said inside of Indigo, right? They compose just fine.
Okay.
In addition to that, on an Indigo service, you can mark a method as having that lexical block set up for you automatically.
Okay.
So you can
Kinda
mark
like
a transaction.
autocomplete.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so in that case, it works like autocomplete from COM+.
Sweet.
Yeah, for those interested, I found the reference. If you go to shrinkster.com 27J, that was the blog that compared the various Java-based IOC containers.
Great.
Isn't Shrinkster awesome? I think it's getting hammered, though. It's getting a little slow.
So I have a question for Ted and Mark, and for Carl, too, I guess. I recently read this paper by Richard Monson-Heifel, who obviously made his name writing EJB books for O'Reilly. And he wrote this wonderful report called J2EE, a Standard in Jeopardy. And in it, what was interesting was he actually predicted, or he called to the large vendors, basically IBM, saying you should just dump this J2EE thing and adopt the open source containers, and that the future is really Spring and Hibernate. Did any of you guys read that?
No, I'd be interested to read it, though.
I didn't read the paper. I'd heard that he, said something to that effect. Part of the thing, too, you have to be a little careful with Richard now, because now that he works for...
Gartner?
Gartner or somebody else?
He works for Burton.
Burton, that's right. He's definitely in a different position now than he was like a year or two ago. But I think in some respects, some of the vendors have, IBM, have already started to do some of that stuff, in the sense that they have begun to adopt more and more of the open source frameworks as part of their offerings, right?
But has WebSphere decided to co-op? I mean, obviously they've spent a lot marketing their Linux involvement, but has IBM adopted Hibernate or Spring in the WebSphere product?
Not Hibernate or Spring, but they have adopted Axis as their web services stack.
But, I've heard that that was the original plan, but they've diverted, and it's no longer the Axis code base inside of WebSphere.
I hadn't heard that.
Maybe, I'm not sure.
I don't know. I freely admit I don't know.
I never
there's
even
probably
heard.
always a place for standards, I suppose, people who want that assurity of compatibility from all the previous EJB releases. But to a large extent, it's true that you could just make an EJB3 sort of pseudo compatible release very easily using Spring and Hibernate. And some things I question the use of the annotations they have, explicitly saying @inject instead of just relying on traditional setter methods or properties to
Well, see, this is the
express
problem
that
we
dependency.
face. This is the problem we face right now in the Java community, is that if we did that, we would be leaving 7 years of production systems in the dust. And even if the vendors bought off on the idea, the people who bought from those vendors would just be up in arms.
Java Plus.
Well, yeah, exactly, right. That's what starts to come to mind is, maybe we should just start over. And do that. You can't do that. When you're a single vendor, like a Microsoft, right? If IBM becomes the dominant vendor in the Java industry, which is a very possible scenario, the way things are going right now. Was that?
I thought it already happened.
It's getting there. Right now, IBM owns something like 40% of the J2E market, which basically says the EJB market. And I think BEA has something like 25%. They used to be at like 30 and 30.
If I was a business manager listening to this conversation, I'd be shitting bricks.
No, I don't think you do that. I really don't, because the numbers overall, at least the numbers that I'm hearing in terms of J2E and .NET projects as a whole, are remaining relatively stable against one another.
Yeah.
But certainly, your choice of vendors within the J2E community has always been shifting around.
Yeah.
I mean, there was never been a place where one guy, from 1 year to the next, had the same percentage market share.
Yeah.
And, of course, you get the whole open source question. How do you track whether or not somebody is a JBoss licensee? Because they just because they downloaded it doesn't mean that they're a licensee anymore.
Don, a question for you from the chat room. There are folks speaking on behalf of Microsoft, Connected Systems Roadshow, for example, that are telling developers OOAD is dead. I think that's coming from Indigo Team with reference to SOA. Is this the new Microsoft view? Is there concurrence in the Java world?
Wow, interesting. Well, so certainly I think OO is done. I think that the people have figured it out. It's taking a long time for OO ideas that were formed in the 80s and to a lesser degree in the 90s to really become mainstream.
You said OOAD in quotes. What is that?
That would probably be object-oriented analysis and design.
Application development, again?
Oh, I've never heard that particular acronym.
Yeah.
I always heard it as OO analysis and design.
Yes, that's what I assume too.
Okay.
Yeah, I think people use all kinds of different methodologies and conceptual systems for thinking about how they're going to structure their software.
Yeah.
OO is one way to do it. And, I think that it's not dead, but I think that, it's a fairly well understood area. And if you look at, kind of as a technology provider, people are kind of solidifying, the state of the practice. I think that the services stuff is huge. There's a lot of opportunity for innovation, and certainly when we think about building systems where we don't have autonomous or we don't have atomic deployment.
Yeah.
The versioning characteristics we get when we use messages and protocols is better. But I don't think it means that objects are going away. It just means that they don't get as much attention because people understand them.
Right.
Look at it this way, Carl. Right, procedural-oriented programming, the world of C.
Right.
Is it dead? Is it gone?
No, I understand. Yeah, just like Don said on the last .NET Rock show he was on, COM isn't dead. It's done. It's gone as far as it's going to go, and you use it, and there you go.
Yeah, I mean, the 10 applications that are communicating to each other, in an SOA environment, are still going to be written in OO fashion.
Right. It's just not the newest new thing. So speaking of SOA, Don, do you know of any large-scale SOA projects out in the real world that have been done or are being done?
Oh, I think people have been building systems this way for a while. We have new language to describe, the kinds of things we're building. But, folks who've been successful with message-oriented middleware have been doing a lot of these ideas, for a good 15-plus years. So
they've just been...
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap in the EAI space, which is where I spent a lot of my time. It's just a lot of standardization now, but a lot of the concepts, the needs are very much the same.
Don't forget the ESBs. The ESBs are also, another name for the same thing.
The enterprise service bus guys,
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, look, we're sending messages back and forth. They're written in some format.
Right.
You're going to, localize them. You're going to import them when you receive a message. You're going to linearize to them when you send it. Big deal,
Yeah.
It's like, it's fascinating that people like to, put lots of, fancy language around it. But at the end of the day, we're just slinging bytes around.
Well, I don't know if you heard
The thing that's so funny, the thing that's so interesting about the whole message, interest in messaging now, is that this is what we were doing back in the the late 80s, early 90s, and you go back, and in this case, for me, the eye-opening was reading Transactional Processing by Gray and Reuter. And they talk about how RPC was created as a way simply to avoid having to deal with the pain of marshaling C structures from one platform to the next. That's all that was really intended to do. And we just went hog nuts wild with the idea of RPCs in general, when realistically it was never intended to hide the fact that messages were being passed.
Is that a West Coast term, hog nuts wild?
Yeah, I just made it up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting if you look at, .NET Remoting was a really interesting historical point because it was effectively an RPC system that really teased apart things like how does the stack frame get turned into messages? How do messages get turned into bytes? And if you walk through the .NET Remoting architecture, whether or not you're ever going to use it in a real app or not, it's actually a really fascinating tour through a lot of the ideas, and it's a really interesting dissection of those ideas.
Mm-hmm. That's one area where I think EJB was very late to catch on in terms of integrating message support into the EJB spec. Happened relatively late.
Oh, that was a travesty. That was a disaster. I mean, the fact that they didn't put that in until the 2.0 release was just a crime against humanity.
Hey, let me ask you guys a question. I mean, I don't know how much Mark has had exposure to this, but at least Ted and Don. BizTalk, the newest BizTalk, different than the original versions that we've seen with, the kind of stuff that they were doing. What's cool about it? And, really, I mean, an objective view. What's cool about BizTalk lately?
Don, you want first crack at this?
Oh, I thought you were asking Mark. I'm sorry.
No, I don't have much experience, so I think...
Yeah, go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I think, the BizTalkers were, have always been fairly forward-thinking. And, when I look at BTS 2004, which is the release they did most recently, there's some really interesting stuff there. For me, the biggest point of interest is the fact that, the control flow is done in a declarative fashion that's decoupled from the typical development process. If you think about it, when you write an Xlang script in BizTalk, it's like you're writing a script, right? You're writing in a fairly high-level language. It's a language that those guys have just tooled the snot out of. I mean, if you compare it to, like, writing a VB program,
right,
it makes VB look like assembly language.
Yeah.
And the fact that that hard distinction between kind of the domain expert working in a very high level language versus the quote unquote systems programmer working in a relatively low level language. I kind of like that model, and I used to really like that model back in the 90s when it was C++ versus VB6. And you're kind of seeing that happening again now in the BizTalk world where, the quote-unquote systems programmers are working in C#, which is a fairly low-level, compiled, opaque language. And then you've got this much more dynamic, transparent language, which is Xlang. And, that's much more approachable to a lot of folks. So I think that stuff's really good. The fact that not only is the language relatively approachable, largely because of the tooling, also the fact that the execution has a lot more runtime support than typical managed code has on the CLR. The fact that I can take a running program, freeze dry it, and then reactivate it on a different machine without any change in app semantics, that's a thing that people want. And that stuff I think is really great, and I think you'll see that stuff become much more mainstream and part of the core platform over time. Certainly on the Indigo team, we look at that stuff and say, yeah, that'd be great stuff to have. So,
okay. Ted, have you got much experience with it?
With BizTalk, no. I haven't spent a hell of a lot of time with it. To be very honest, one of the things that happens to you when you start writing and talking and speaking is you end up doing a lot of writing and talking.
Yeah, right.
Not a whole lot of, getting down and grungy with stuff. So BizTalk is one of those things I haven't gotten down and grungy with. But
I'm in the same boat.
I look at BizTalk, 04, and have talked with some folks who have gotten down and grungy with it. And a buddy of mine, who's just recently written a class for it, he said basically you look at BizTalk and you say it's one big messaging engine. And I think if you look at, I'm going to send out a book reference here, the Enterprise Integration Patterns book by Gregor Hopi and Bobby Wolf. Awesome book. I mean, ignore the title. It's all about messaging.
What's the title again?
Enterprise Integration Patterns. Part of the Martin Fowler series, the black and red hardbound series. You know what I'm talking about?
No, but I'm just writing it down so I can get a link.
Oh, yeah.
The Addison Wesley Signature Series.
That's it. Yeah. That's the name of the series.
Okay.
And the signature happens to be Martin Fowler's.
In this case, right. And that book is it's got to be like 35, 40 some odd different patterns regarding messages and all the various things you can do with messaging. You read this book,
cool, and
you instantly become a convert to the beauty of messaging as opposed to the relative crudeness of a traditional RPC.
Right.
If you're at eaipatterns.com.
Is that the URL?
Yeah, so the website for the book or...
Okay. I think there's actually some content on the website that's not in the book. So they've been playing.
Yeah, the book used to be on the website long before there was a book.
Right.
It's eaipatterns.com, you said? EAI?
Yeah, EAI.
Okay.
Enterprise Application Integration.
Okay.
Anyway, it really sort of transforms your worldview in many respects. And I think BizTalk, from what I've heard, from what I've seen, from what I've read, it's sort of true to that model where it really is a question of passing messages around. And frankly, when you start talking about application workflows and so forth, that's really what people want, is opportunities to send this from here to there, and it'll sit there for a while it gets operated on in some fashion before it goes to this other location. And that is the definition of workflow.
Right. What do you think about the drag droppiness of BizTalk?
That part I don't care so much about, truthfully.
Yeah.
And I know that there's been this sort of holy grail since, the very, very early days.
Right.
Of, we want to get non-programmers to be able to write systems.
Right.
And, maybe this go around they might actually have something, but I'll admit I'm skeptical. I mean, I still remember when VB3 shipped and people said, "Oh, cool, now we can have managers writing code."
Right. Secretaries.
Yeah, I think that never happens. I've seen variation of this product through TIBCO over the years, integration management, how business works, and so on. And I think Gregor as well came up with a term for them, doodleware. But a lot of times they just end up people making doodles with them and not really doing what they should be doing.
Do you think it'll ever happen? Any of you guys ever happen that a business person will be able to walk up to a computer and more or less have a conversation with it and ching, 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 whoosh, spits out the perfect application?
What was that again? Ching, ching, ching.
Sounds too mechanical. I think I saw that in Star Trek.
Carl Franklin, ladies and gentlemen. He'll be here all week.
Get the
Finish.
chainsaw impersonation. Sorry.
They're never boring on the .NET Rock Show.
I had to do the chainsaw.
To a certain degree, Carl, I hope they never do, because it means we're all out of a job.
Oh, of course, but I mean, it's, every once in a while you got to think to yourself, well, the rate machines are growing in intelligence and layers, and, it's going to happen someday, don't you think?
Well, let me ask you this. When's the last time you walked up to a carpenter, a plumber, a drywaller, and told him what you wanted in terms of building your house?
Oh, yeah, but the tools haven't changed in hundreds of years, and our tools are changing.
They haven't changed in 100 years?
Okay. The rate of change is significantly different. The rate of change in technology.
But fundamentally, right, the job is still the same, to take all these basic building blocks, or take the people who know how to manipulate those building blocks,
right, I know,
put
but
it together in some coherent fashion.
But if you have robots that do everything and you just go bip, 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 and they do it, now you have a significant tool change.
Well, you guys also, there are modular homes still that get put together out of, 4 or 5 large pieces, and the amount of labor that goes into that is, minuscule compared to, a carpenter building a home from a set of blueprints.
Yeah, but the Amish have been building barns in a day for 100-some-odd years. You can't tell me it's just a question of the tools.
So, Ted, are you saying you take an Amish approach to technology?
No. I'm saying that,
I'm just kidding,
saying that
buddy.
when you know, and it's very clear in everybody's mind what it is you're building, you can build a barn in a day.
Yeah.
But the thing is, nobody wants the plain barn, right? Nobody wants just the plain vanilla what the vendor is selling. People want customizations. People want you to tune it to their particular business, to their particular needs. This is why, for example, we never saw really a server-side component market, right? Despite the fact that both sides tried so hard. Both the Microsoft side and the Java side tried so hard to get this notion of VB-like controls, VB-like components you could just drop in, right? Sun spent a lot of time talking about your accounting being, and you had application assemblers, people who just took these off-the-shelf things and dropped them into their backend.
Dude,
and it all just worked.
I agree with you that it hasn't happened yet, and many attempts have been made and failed, but someday, don't you think?
I don't think so, Carl.
You don't think so?
What's accounts receivable to you is different from accounts receivable to me.
Oh, sure, I know, but if the logic and the discernment is in there, and who knows?
I don't think so.
I think some problems, things like BizTalk and business work, I think have really reduced to a much smaller time scale. Certainly, for example, if you want to integrate PeopleSoft with another billing application, they both have very well-defined schemas now on both sides, and you can really, in fact, drag and drop and do a significant amount of integration that with custom coding would have taken a long time to do.
How about you, Don? Do you have you want to make a projection about the future after you're dead,
Oh, look, I think that, there's obviously a lot of demand for people who don't have the attention span to program in C# or even modern-day VB to be able to build software, or at least customize software. And, most of software is integration. Very few people get to write all new code. Almost all of software is just, bringing, yesterday's legacy into make it tomorrow's. Yeah. So I think that, there's obviously going to be a lot of activity in this space, all across the industry. I definitely think the vendor who can figure out, or the open source project leader who can figure out how to tap into that, pool of technically savvy but not programmer focused folks who want to just solve problems with their computers, that's like a killer app, and if someone can do it, that's great. And certainly, there's no shortage of people here trying to solve that problem. I know there's no shortage of people at IBM trying to solve the same problem. And hopefully somebody will come up with the right combination of abstractions, concepts, tools, visualizations,
standards too, right?
Blah blah blah.
The standards too, like the standards of policy and security, and the SOA standards. If you have System A, written up to standard, and System B written up to standard, where to a certain extent the applications can explore and sort of reflect the policies and act accordingly. I mean, isn't that a step towards, total automation someday? I'm not saying that we're there.
I don't look at the web service protocols as being the primary enabler. I mean, certainly they're one of many factors.
But it's getting, it's getting
there.
The goal has been the same. I mean, even Corba with dynamic discovery was supposed to be able to do that.
Right.
Yeah, a really interesting technology to look at is this thing called MIIS, which is Microsoft Identity Integration Server. And it's just this BizTalk-esque environment for folks who do directory work and identity management work. And, you can do a ton of damage with that thing without writing lots of real programs. And it's really targeted at, kind of the IT pro, not the, Ted Newards of the world. But, it's actually, I look at that and I think, there are things that could be done. And, I'm sure that there are other ones out in nature as well. I happen to be familiar with that one. So, I think people want to go after that market, and it's not a bad. You're not hurting humanity by enabling people to control their computers. I mean, it's kind of the whole purpose of software, after all.
Right.
There's an interesting book that just came out, Carl. Along sort of this, what some of the folks at Microsoft think is the next generation, called software factories. This is Keith Short, who's I think he's part of the Team System project at Microsoft. At least he was when I interviewed him for the server side.
He still is.
What's that?
He still is.
He still is, okay. And it's just this notion of, being able to sort of churn software out at sort of a higher level, being able to sort of move up the abstraction stack one more time, and get to that point of being able to do this. And I admit he's got a compelling argument. Like I said, I remain skeptical that we'll ever get there. I think what happens is as the factories get larger, the skill of the workers just has to get stronger, and that to some degree is his point. That machining has made it such that people don't screw together computer cases by hand. A robot does that, but somebody has to maintain the robot, and somebody still has to sit down and tell the robot what to do.
Yeah.
It just means that we get smarter as an industry.
Right. And, I made this point before, I think it was on Rory's blog, then you echoed it too, Ted, that the day that, the business person that hires us programmers can walk up to a machine like an ice cream vendor and say, I want this, that, and the other thing, and it, and it spits it out, we're done, man.
But I really don't know that that's ever going to happen, because somebody's still going to have to, write the ice cream machine and get that to work.
Of course,
of course. The definition of the problem will change. We will still have work to do.
But this industry, of course, has a history of innovating ourselves out of jobs. You know what I mean?
Oh, it seems to be growing.
No, I completely disagree, Carl.
Do you really?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we basically just reinvent the same crap every 10 years.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting, though, is kind of this, this post-bubble mentality that we actually have to deliver real value to humanity, because they're just not going to keep paying us insane salaries to, keep adding in direction to problems.
Yeah.
I think there's an important lesson there. And, I think people, there'll always be technical jobs. There'll always be jobs in software. But
Sure.
I think that increasingly you're going to have some kind of domain expertise other than
right.
Design patterns and programming languages and operating systems.
For case in point, I'm teaching some guys at CarMax this week. They came up to my class, and a lot of them weren't developers. They had the business experience, and they understood the business model. They understood the domain, and then they became programmers. Just in the IT department, went specifically recruiting in all these other departments where they found people who really understood the business, and they trained them as programmers. So,
Yeah, for very complex domains, that could be
right. Well, I was just consulting for a gas and oil company out in Denver, and they were talking about how they've been building this, gas and oil object domain, and they've been working on it since 1993. And it puts anything that any object programmer has ever done to shame. I mean, it's just insane what they have to deal with and how they have to deal with it and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly the case, that we as programmers, we got lazy for a long period of time, and we got to a point where we said, look, if it's not in the spec, I don't have to do it. And what that did is that basically, convinced a lot of business managers that we were unreliable. we couldn't be trusted to get what they wanted done right or to have their best interests in mind. And so there's been this search, for all sorts of different ways. To a certain degree, if projects are going to fail, people are looking for ways to fail more cheaply. And Don, I think, nails it right. We need to, we as programmers need to take it on ourselves to say, my job here is to deliver value.
Right.
How's the best way to do that? Is it using .NET? Is it using Java? Is it using COBOL? Right. And follow that path.
You heard it here. Ted said to follow the path of COBOL.
If that's the right answer to the problem, absolutely. I'll stamp my name to it.
I heard that quote more than once from Ted.
You guys haven't heard what I did with Ralph Nader, so, I can make you say anything in the editing. Oh, man. So we're way over time here, so maybe we should wrap it up. So before I let you go, why don't I go around to the three of you guys and just give you a chance to plug what you're doing, working on, and any calls to action. Mark.
Yeah, well, I'm obviously plugging Spring.net. The URL is springframework.net, and you should just check it out, read the documentation, and hope you find the software useful.
Okay. Ted, what are you doing these days?
Writing, seminars, lectures, that sort of thing. Effective Enterprise Java just shipped. Seems to be doing fairly well. So if anybody's looking for somebody to come in and talk to you about how to build enterprise applications such that they can scale and perform and so forth, give me a call. Ted@Neward.net.
You do that? You go to somebody's company and talk to them about how to scale?
Believe it or not, Carl, yes.
Wow.
Yes, I have done it in the past, and I will do it again.
Wow, that's awesome, man. You should hire Ted.
There you go.
Don, what are you doing these days?
Let's see. Indigo has a beta coming out next year, and I'm, closing it down some, final open issues on that stuff, and looking beyond that.
Do we have a date on Indigo beta yet, Don?
Yes, we do.
Cool.
20 questions?
Is it bigger than Redbox?
Smaller than a car.
Yes, there will be a beta next year.
Okay.
All right, guys. Well, listen, on behalf of myself, and Rory's not here, but I'm sure he's really bumming that he's missing this, but I want to thank you guys for coming on the show, and man, this was just an awesome conversation. Like I said in the beginning of the show, I feel seriously outclassed, and I just thank all of you guys for discussing things with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Carl.
All right. Hey,
Good night, Carl.
Good night, Don.
We miss you, Rory.
Time boy, life is hard.